The city of Riverside, nestled in the heart of Missouri, was a place of jarring contrasts. Gleaming office towers and bustling downtown streets painted a picture of progress, but venture a few blocks further, and the cracks in that facade were impossible to ignore. In the predominantly black neighborhoods of the East Side, poverty and systemic neglect were etched into the crumbling sidewalks, where residents battled the daily reminders of inequality. Officer Daryl Hunt, a 40-year-old white cop, was both a symptom and a symbol of the tensions that plagued the city. In his 15 years on the force, Daryl had built a reputation. To his superiors, he was a man of action, unafraid to take control of volatile situations. But to Riverside's black residents, he was a menace. Daryl's reputation for racial bias wasn't hidden. It was whispered in community meetings, lamented in living rooms, and occasionally screamed at protests. He didn't just harbor prejudiced beliefs, he acted on them unapologetically. His approach was as predictable as it was ruthless. Young black men were suspicious. Black drivers in nicer cars were probably drug dealers. Black families walking home late at night were potential troublemakers. Daryl operated on a toxic blend of stereotypes and unchecked power. "Better safe than sorry," he'd mutter, justifying his actions, though the safety he sought was always for people who looked like him, never for those he policed. A month ago, his pattern of behavior reached a boiling point. Daryl had pulled over Malcolm Brown, a 22-year-old black law student, for what he described as erratic driving. In truth, Malcolm had done nothing more than drive his used BMW through a predominantly white neighborhood. Daryl's tone was hostile from the start, and when Malcolm, calm but firm, asked why he was being stopped, Daryl responded by yanking him out of the car and slapping on handcuffs. "You're resisting," he barked, ignoring the young man's protests. Malcolm was taken to the station and booked on charges of resisting arrest and obstructing justice. What Daryl didn't anticipate was the backlash. Unbeknownst to him, Malcolm's arrest had been captured on camera by multiple bystanders, and within hours the videos were circulating online. The footage was damning. Malcolm's voice steady, insisting on his rights. Daryl's aggression escalating with every unanswered demand. For the black community of Riverside, this was the last straw. Protests erupted outside the precinct, fueled by years of pent-up frustration, and the overwhelming evidence that Daryl's actions weren't isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of abuse. At the same time, Judge Elaine Thompson found herself thrust into the eye of the storm. At 52, Elaine was no stranger to the pressures of her role. As the first black woman to serve on Riverside's Superior Court, she had spent her career walking a tightrope, balancing the weight of community expectations with the unyielding demands of the law. Raised in the Deep South, Elaine had grown up hearing her parents' stories of segregation and injustice. Those experiences shaped her, instilling in her a fierce determination to rise above the barriers that society had placed in her path. But now, the very system she had dedicated her life to was testing her resolve in ways she hadn't imagined. Elaine had been assigned to oversee the trial of Officer Daryl Hunt. The charges, racial discrimination, abuse of power, and excessive force, were not just serious, they were explosive. The trial had become a flashpoint for Riverside, with activists rallying for accountability, and Daryl's defenders arguing he was being unfairly vilified for doing his job. Every decision Elaine made would be scrutinized, dissected, and debated. She knew that for many the case wasn't just about Daryl Hunt, it was about justice itself, what it meant, who it served, and whether it could ever be impartial in a city like Riverside. As she sat in her chambers that morning, Elaine reviewed the case files with a growing sense of unease. The evidence against Daryl was overwhelming. Years of complaints from community members, internal reports of misconduct, and of course, the video of Malcolm's arrest. But this trial wasn't just about facts. It was about perception. Could she deliver a verdict that satisfied the demands of justice while maintaining the integrity of the court? And more personally, how could she navigate a case that hit so close to home? The parallels between Malcolm's experience and her own family's struggles were impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Daryl remained defiant. Sitting in the precinct's break room, he laughed off the trial as a witch hunt, joking with his colleagues about how the system would protect him, just as it always had. "They can't touch me," he said, his voice dripping with confidence. All I did was stop a kid who looked out of place. If they want to make it about race, that's on them." His arrogance was palpable, a product of years spent operating without consequence. The stage was set for a collision that would reverberate far beyond the courtroom. Daryl Hunt, a man whose authority had long gone unchecked, would finally be held to account. And Elaine Thompson, a judge whose very presence on the bench was a testament to resilience, would be tasked with delivering justice in a system that often seemed designed to prevent it. For Elaine, this case wasn't just another trial. It was a reckoning, a chance to expose the fractures in Riverside's institutions and demand accountability where it had long been absent. For Daryl, it was an inconvenience, a bump in the road he believed would soon be smoothed over. But for the people of Riverside, it was a moment of truth, one that would either affirm their hope or shatter it entirely. Riverside wasn't just a city. It was a microcosm of America's enduring struggles with race, power, and justice. The East Side, home to Riverside's Black and Latino communities, bore the brunt of decades of neglect. Dilapidated schools, underfunded housing projects, and scarce job opportunities painted a stark contrast to the glimmering skyline of downtown, where power brokers made decisions that rarely considered the voices of the marginalized. This was the world that shaped Malcolm Brown and the community that Elaine Thompson still called home, despite her rise in stature. Malcolm had grown up just 5 blocks from the courthouse where he now interned. Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep him and his younger sister in school, he understood from an early age that survival required both resilience and strategy. At 22, Malcolm was charismatic, sharp, and determined to make a difference, not just for himself, but for the people who had invested their hopes in him. He was 1 semester away from graduating with honors, and had already secured a position with a prominent civil rights law firm. Yet none of his achievements had shielded him from Daryl Hunt's aggression that day. Since his arrest, Malcolm had become an unintentional symbol of the fight against police misconduct. Community leaders had rallied around him, using his story to spotlight systemic abuse. Despite his outward composure, Malcolm felt the pressure mounting. "I'm not a martyr," he confessed to his mother one night. "I just want to finish school, get my degree, and help people. But now it's like everyone's counting on me to fix something I didn't break." Elaine Thompson had watched Malcolm grow from a distance, often spotting him at local community events or during his internship in the courthouse. She admired his tenacity and his refusal to be defined by his circumstances. As she studied his case, however, she couldn't ignore the echoes of her own journey. Decades earlier, she had been a young Black law student navigating the prejudices of a system designed to exclude people like her. The parallels weren't lost on her, and they weighed heavily on her as she prepared for the trial. Elaine's role as a judge was complicated by her roots in the very community she now presided over. While her colleagues often retreated to gated suburbs, Elaine chose to stay in the East Side, living in a modest home surrounded by the same challenges she had grown up with. This decision had earned her respect, but it also made her a lightning rod for criticism. To some, she was a hero. To others, a figure of impossible expectations. Her every decision was dissected, her every word scrutinized. Daryl Hunt, on the other hand, had no such concerns about community perception. His world revolved around the precinct, where camaraderie with his fellow officers reinforced his belief that he was part of an unassailable brotherhood. The Riverside Police Department was an institution steeped in tradition, where loyalty often trumped accountability. Daryl had learned early in his career that filing reports wasn't about truth, but optics. As long as his actions could be justified on paper, he was untouchable. Over the years, Daryl's methods had been questioned by a handful of junior officers, but their concerns were either dismissed or quietly buried by superiors. The department's unspoken rule was clear: protect your own. This culture of impunity had emboldened Daryl, allowing his prejudices to shape his approach to law enforcement. "I've been doing this job long enough to know who the real threats are," he often said, a refrain that shielded his actions from deeper scrutiny. Yet even within the police force, cracks were beginning to show. Officer Rachel Alvarez, a rookie who had witnessed Daryl's treatment of Malcolm that day, had been grappling with her conscience. Raised in a working-class Latino family, Rachel had joined the force with aspirations of bridging the gap between law enforcement and the communities she loved. Watching Daryl berate Malcolm and escalate the situation had shaken her faith in the institution, but speaking out felt impossible. "You don't go against the blue," her partner had warned her. "Not if you want to last." As the trial date approached, tensions in Riverside grew. Protesters gathered daily outside the courthouse, their chants echoing through the marble halls. Signs reading, "Justice for Malcolm and no more Hunts" filled the square, while counter-protesters argued that the trial was a sham, orchestrated by anti-police radicals. The media frenzy was relentless, amplifying every detail of the case and polarizing the city further. Within this charged atmosphere, the key players prepared for their roles. Malcolm, determined but weary, leaned on his family and friends for strength. Elaine, resolute yet introspective, steeled herself for the scrutiny she knew was coming. And Daryl, confident to the point of delusion, remained steadfast in his belief that the system would protect him. But as the city simmered, a quiet shift was taking place. Small but significant acts, Rachel's mounting doubts, Malcolm's refusal to be silenced, and Elaine's commitment to justice, were beginning to tip the balance. In Riverside, where power had long seemed immutable, the seeds of change were being sown. The trial of Officer Daryl Hunt began on a brisk Monday morning, the courthouse surrounded by a sea of protesters. The air buzzed with tension, a mix of anticipation and unease rippling through the crowd. For the residents of Riverside, this wasn't just about Malcolm Brown. It was about years of unchecked police power, systemic racism, and a community's desperate demand for accountability. For Daryl, it was an unwelcome formality. He walked into the courthouse flanked by his lawyer, head held high, a faint smirk playing on his lips. His demeanor was defiant, exuding the confidence of someone who had always played the game and won. Inside the packed courtroom, Judge Elaine Thompson sat composed on the bench, her expression revealing nothing of the turmoil beneath. As the case was called to order, her gavel struck like a lightning bolt, silencing the room. Elaine's gaze swept across the space, taking in the faces of Malcolm, Daryl, and the jury. She knew the weight of this moment. It wasn't just the facts she had to contend with, it was the perception of justice itself. Malcolm took the stand on the first day, his voice steady, but his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He recounted the events of that night, painting a vivid picture of the humiliation he felt as Daryl dragged him from his car and cuffed him in front of a gathering crowd. "I wasn't angry at first," Malcolm said, his voice tightening. "I was confused. I thought there had to be a mistake, but then I realized it wasn't a mistake. It was just the way things are for people like me." The prosecution presented the viral video of Malcolm's arrest, the courtroom silent except for the harsh sound of Daryl's voice shouting orders. The footage spoke volumes. It showed Malcolm calm and compliant while Daryl's aggression escalated without cause. The jury shifted uncomfortably as the video played, the tension in the room palpable. For Elaine, watching the video was like reliving 1,000 stories she'd heard growing up. Stories of dignity stripped away under the guise of authority. Daryl's defense lawyer, a sharp-tongued man named Elliot Grayson, painted a different narrative. He argued that Daryl's actions were justified, that Malcolm had been uncooperative, and that the officer's instincts had been honed by years of experience. "Officer Hunt acted to protect himself and the community," Grayson proclaimed, his voice commanding. "In situations like these, officers have only seconds to make decisions that the rest of us have the luxury to debate for months." The defense strategy relied heavily on character witnesses. Several officers testified, vouching for Daryl's professionalism and dedication to the job. But under cross-examination, cracks began to appear. The prosecutor, Angela Carter, was relentless, challenging each witness with facts and figures that exposed patterns of racial bias within the department. She presented records of Daryl's past complaints, dozens filed by black residents, each dismissed without investigation. "Officer Hunt's history isn't one of split-second decisions," Angela argued. "It's one of deliberate and systemic abuse." Outside the courtroom, the city was in turmoil. Protests grew larger and more volatile, with clashes breaking out between demonstrators and police. Malcolm's friends and family gathered every evening to support him, their home becoming a hub for community leaders strategizing their next moves. Meanwhile, Daryl's defenders grew louder, accusing the media and activists of conducting a witch hunt. On local radio shows and social media, arguments raged, each side digging deeper into their beliefs. Amid this chaos, an unlikely voice emerged. Officer Rachel Alvarez, the rookie cop who had witnessed Malcolm's arrest, was struggling with the weight of her silence. Every day she replayed the scene in her mind, the way Daryl's voice had sharpened, the way Malcolm had stood there, calm and respectful, as Daryl escalated the situation. Rachel had entered the force believing in the motto, serve and protect, but the past few weeks had shattered her illusions. Late one night, Rachel found herself parked outside Malcolm's house, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she debated her next move. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage she had, she stepped out of the car and knocked on the door. Malcolm's mother, surprised but polite, invited her inside. "I don't know if this will help," Rachel said, her voice trembling, "but I saw what happened that night, and it wasn't right." The revelation was a turning point. Rachel's testimony, delivered reluctantly but truthfully, was a bombshell in the courtroom. Officer Hunt escalated the situation unnecessarily, she admitted under oath. Malcolm Brown posed no threat. He was calm, cooperative, and respectful. Her words sent shockwaves through the courtroom, her fellow officers glaring at her as if she'd betrayed their unspoken code. For Daryl, Rachel's testimony was a dagger. His smirk disappeared, replaced by a hardened scowl. He'd underestimated the young rookie, assuming her silence was guaranteed. But now, cracks were forming in the armor he'd relied on for so long. The community's response to Rachel's bravery was electric. For many, it was proof that change, though slow and painful, was possible. But for Elaine, the case had become even more delicate. The truth was emerging, but so were the risks. Threats were circulating online, aimed at Rachel, Malcolm, and even Elaine herself. The tension in Riverside had reached a boiling point, and everyone knew the verdict would either ignite hope or explode into chaos. As the trial unfolded, the case against Daryl Hunt grew more layered, revealing not just his personal biases, but the systemic issues that had allowed them to flourish. The courtroom became a battlefield where narratives of justice, power, and accountability clashed. Yet, beyond the main conflict, smaller, more personal struggles began to emerge, weaving together a tapestry of humanity amidst the chaos. For Malcolm, the trial had become an emotional crucible. What began as a fight for his dignity had spiraled into something far bigger. Each day in court, he faced not only Daryl's cold gaze but also the weight of a community rallying around him. He spent sleepless nights preparing to testify again, agonizing over every word. Would his story be enough? Could he convey the pain of the experience without being dismissed as too emotional or too angry? His closest friend, Devin, urged him to remember why he'd agreed to press charges in the first place. "This isn't just about you," Devin said one night, sitting on the porch of Malcolm's home. "It's about everyone who never got their day in court." For Elaine, the case was testing her boundaries as both a judge and a person. She remained outwardly composed during the proceedings, her voice steady, her rulings firm. But privately, she struggled. The strain of balancing her objectivity with her own lived experiences weighed heavily on her. She'd spent her career proving that a black woman could be fair, impartial, and unshakable in a world that constantly questioned her competence. Yet this case threatened to tip her carefully constructed scales. Late at night, she often found herself staring at old family photos, her father's voice echoing in her mind. "We can't afford to make mistakes, Elaine. They're always watching." Elaine's inner conflict deepened when she received an anonymous letter at her home. It was brief but chilling. "Stay neutral or you'll regret it." For a moment, fear gripped her. But then, a deeper resolve took hold. "This is exactly why I'm here," she whispered to herself. The letter became a reminder of the stakes, not just for Malcolm but for everyone who needed to believe that justice could prevail. Meanwhile, Rachel Alvarez, the rookie cop who had testified against Daryl, found herself increasingly isolated within the police department. Her colleagues barely spoke to her, and her superiors assigned her to desk duty under the pretense of protecting her safety. But Rachel knew the truth. She had broken the unwritten rule of loyalty. As she sat in her small, cluttered office, she felt the weight of her decision bearing down on her. "Did I do the right thing?" she wondered aloud one evening, her voice breaking. Her mentor, Sergeant Luis Navarro, surprised her with a visit that night. A veteran officer with a reputation for integrity, Luis placed a hand on her shoulder. "You told the truth," he said softly. "And in this job, That's the hardest thing to do. Don't let them make you doubt it. Outside the courtroom, the city of Riverside had become a powder keg. Protests intensified, with daily marches through downtown drawing crowds from neighboring cities. The courthouse steps were lined with activists holding signs that read, "Justice for Malcolm" and "End Police Violence." Local businesses boarded up their windows, fearing unrest, while police presence in the streets grew heavier. Helicopters buzzed overhead, and the tension was palpable. For many, the trial wasn't just about one man or one incident. It was a reckoning for the entire city. Amid this unrest, the media latched onto every twist in the case, turning it into a national spectacle. News anchors debated the implications of Rachel's testimony, and commentators speculated on whether Elaine could deliver an unbiased verdict. Pundits on conservative outlets framed Daryl as a victim of anti-police hysteria, while progressive platforms highlighted the systemic racism his actions represented. The narrative had spiraled out of Riverside's control, leaving residents feeling both empowered and overwhelmed. Behind the scenes, Daryl's lawyer, Elliot Grayson, began to worry. Rachel's testimony had thrown a wrench into their strategy, and the prosecution's relentless focus on Daryl's history painted a damning picture. Grayson met with Daryl late one evening to discuss damage control. "We need something to shift the jury's perspective," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't going the way we expected." But Daryl, stubborn as ever, dismissed the idea of compromise. "I'm not apologizing for doing my job," he spat. "If they don't like it, that's their problem." As the trial neared its midpoint, it became clear that the stakes were growing with each passing day. The lines between right and wrong were stark for some, blurred for others. For Malcolm, Elaine, Rachel, and even Daryl, the case was forcing them to confront truths they might have preferred to avoid. And for the city of Riverside, the outcome would set a precedent. Whether it was one of accountability or continued impunity remained to be seen. The tension in Riverside reached its zenith as the trial entered its final days. Each testimony, each piece of evidence, and each subtle shift in courtroom dynamics seemed to tighten the city's collective breath. The national media had turned its full attention to the case, with headlines framing it as a defining moment in America's struggle against systemic racism. For the people in that courtroom, however, it was far more personal. It was during the cross-examination of Officer Rachel Alvarez that the turning point came. Rachel, now a reluctant hero to many, sat on the witness stand, her uniform pristine but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her testimony had already shaken the defense's case, but it was the prosecution's decision to push further that changed everything. Angela Carter, the fiery prosecutor, asked Rachel a question that no one expected. "Officer Alvarez," Angela began, her voice steady, "you've told us what you witnessed that night. But I need to ask, was this the first time you saw Officer Hunt behave this way?" The courtroom fell silent. Daryl Hunt's jaw tightened, his glare fixed on Rachel. She hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on her. The judge's gavel struck lightly. "Answer the question, officer," Elaine said, her tone measured but firm. Rachel took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she replied, "No, it wasn't the first time." The words seemed to echo in the courtroom. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, quickly silenced by Elaine's gavel. "Order," she commanded, her expression unreadable. Angela stepped forward, her tone sharpened. "What do you mean by that, Officer Alvarez? Can you elaborate?" Rachel hesitated again, visibly battling her own fear. Finally, she spoke. "I mean that I've seen him target people before. People of color. He treats them differently, rougher, harsher. And when I questioned it, I was told to keep my head down." Daryl's lawyer immediately objected, his voice booming. "Speculation, Your Honor. This is irrelevant and prejudicial." But Elaine, after a moment's pause, overruled. "I'll allow it," she said. The jury leaned forward, their attention riveted. Angela pressed on. "So, Officer Alvarez, you're saying this behavior isn't an isolated incident?" Rachel nodded, her voice steadying. "That's correct. It's a pattern." The admission was a bombshell. The prosecution had built a solid case around the specifics of Malcolm's arrest, but Rachel's testimony now painted Daryl as emblematic of a larger, more insidious issue. The defense scrambled to mitigate the damage, calling their own witnesses to refute Rachel's claims. But the momentum had shifted. The jury couldn't unhear what had been said. Outside the courtroom, The news of Rachel's testimony spread like wildfire. The protesters who had been gathering outside erupted into cheers when the revelation hit the airwaves. For them, it wasn't just about Malcolm anymore. It was about every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or brutalized under the same system. But not everyone was celebrating. Daryl's defenders grew more vocal, their rhetoric escalating. Counter-protests swelled, and tensions between the two sides boiled over into skirmishes. Social media exploded with hashtags like Check Justice for Malcolm and Take a Stand with Hunt, creating a digital battleground as polarized as the streets of Riverside. For Daryl, the turning point wasn't just a legal shift, it was personal. He felt the walls closing in. At home, he stared at the television as pundits dissected his career, his choices, and now his character. His lawyer, Elliot Grayson, was growing increasingly frustrated. "You need to stop watching this crap and focus," Elliot snapped during a late-night meeting at Daryl's house. "The jury doesn't care about what's trending on Twitter. They care about what happens in that courtroom." Daryl, however, wasn't listening. His anger was simmering, threatening to boil over. "This is all bullshit," he muttered, pacing the room. "I've done nothing wrong. These people just don't get it. They don't get what it's like out there." But even Daryl's staunchest allies in the police force were beginning to distance themselves. The department, now under national scrutiny, issued a carefully worded statement about accountability and reform. Behind closed doors, Daryl's captain told him bluntly, "We can't protect you if this goes south. You're on your own." Meanwhile, Elaine Thompson found herself at a personal crossroads. She had always prided herself on impartiality, on letting the law guide her decisions. But as the trial neared its conclusion, she felt the weight of her community's expectations pressing harder than ever. One evening, after a long day in court, she visited her childhood church. Sitting in the quiet sanctuary, she closed her eyes and thought of her parents, her mentors, and all the people who had helped her reach this moment. "This isn't about me," she whispered to the empty room. "It's about them. It's always been about them." The trial's turning point wasn't just about Rachel's testimony. It was about what it represented. A crack in the armor of a system that had shielded officers like Daryl for far too long. For the first time, accountability felt within reach. But the battle was far from over, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The aftermath of Rachel Alvarez's testimony rippled far beyond the courtroom, setting off a chain reaction across Riverside. For many, her words represented a watershed moment, a rare instance of someone breaking the code of silence within the police force. But for others, it was a betrayal, and the fallout from her decision was swift and merciless. At the precinct, Rachel found herself ostracized. Her former colleagues avoided her in the hallways, their conversations stopping the moment she entered a room. Her locker was vandalized with the words "rat" scrawled in black marker, and anonymous notes warning her to watch her back were slipped into her mail. The isolation was suffocating, but Rachel stood firm, clinging to the belief that she had done the right thing. Malcolm Brown, too, was grappling with the consequences of the trial's escalation. The courtroom victories, the video evidence, Rachel's revelations, should have felt like progress, but the pressure was taking a toll. Protesters had camped outside his house chanting his name, calling him a hero. Yet Malcolm didn't feel heroic. He felt exposed. Strangers approached him on the street, offering support or asking for selfies, as if he were a celebrity rather than a young man trying to finish law school. One night, after a particularly grueling day in court, Malcolm confronted his mother. "Why does everyone think I'm some kind of savior?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. "I'm not here to save the world, Mom. I just wanted to live my life." His mother, Linda, looked at him with a quiet strength that had carried her through decades of struggle. "You didn't choose this, Malcolm," she said softly. "But now that it's here, you have to see it through. Not for them, for yourself. You deserve justice." Outside the courthouse, the protests continued to swell. The square had become a meeting ground for activists, journalists, and curious onlookers. Tensions between opposing groups escalated into full-blown confrontations. On one side, chants of justice for Malcolm rang out, accompanied by calls to defund the police. On the other, counter-protesters waved Blue Lives Matter flags, accusing the trial of being a sham and labeling Rachel a traitor. The conflict turned violent one evening when a scuffle broke out between the two groups. Police in riot gear descended on the scene, their presence only inflaming the chaos. Tear gas filled the air, and the images of protesters fleeing through the smoky streets dominated the news the next morning. The city's fragile sense of order was crumbling, and Riverside was teetering on the edge of an eruption. In the midst of the chaos, Judge Elaine Thompson maintained her composure, but behind closed doors, she was fighting her own battles. The anonymous threats she'd received were becoming more frequent, each one more chilling than the last. Security around her home and the courthouse had been increased, and her family had urged her to step down from the case. But Elaine refused. One evening, as she prepared for the next day in court, her daughter Jessica called her. "Mom, I'm scared for you," Jessica admitted, her voice trembling. "Why can't someone else handle this? Why does it have to be you?" Elaine closed her eyes, her throat tightening. "Because if I back down," she replied, "what does that say to every person who's ever believed in me? What does it say to the people who need to see that this system can work, even when it feels impossible?" As the trial neared its conclusion, Daryl Hunt's demeanor began to shift. The smug confidence he'd carried into the courtroom was fading, replaced by a simmering resentment. His lawyer, Elliot Grayson, had grown more combative in his defense, attacking the credibility of Rachel and Malcolm at every turn. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury's reactions were becoming harder to read. Daryl's isolation mirrored Rachel's, though his was largely self-imposed. His colleagues were cautious in their support, knowing that his trial had brought unwelcome scrutiny to the department. At home, Daryl's wife, Karen, struggled to hold their family together. "You need to think about what happens if this doesn't go your way," she warned one night, her voice trembling with worry. But Daryl snapped back, "There's nothing to think about. I didn't do anything wrong." As Riverside simmered, one question loomed. Would the verdict bring relief or push the city into further chaos? The pressure on everyone involved, Malcolm, Rachel, Elaine, and even Daryl, was immense. The trial had become a symbol of more than just one man's guilt or innocence. It was a test of whether justice could prevail in a system so deeply entrenched in inequity. For Elaine, the burden of that question was heavier than ever. Sitting alone in her chambers late one night, she stared at the scales of justice engraved on the wall, their symbolism both inspiring and mocking. She whispered to herself, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I have to believe this is worth it." As the trial drew to its final week, the key players in Riverside's drama found themselves facing truths that would forever shape their lives. The weight of the case, the public attention, and the personal stakes had forged a crucible that none could escape unscathed. Yet, within that crucible, transformations began to emerge. For Malcolm Brown, the overwhelming pressure had forced him to confront his fears and doubts head-on. He had spent weeks questioning his role in this fight, feeling like an unwilling figurehead for a movement that was much larger than himself. But as he sat in his quiet bedroom one evening, reading through a stack of letters from strangers, students, parents, activists, Malcolm began to see the broader impact of his courage. One letter stood out. It was from an elderly man who wrote, "What you're doing is something I wish I could have done when I was your age. Maybe if I had, my grandchildren wouldn't be afraid every time they leave the house. You're changing more than you realize." Malcolm folded the letter and placed it on his desk, the words echoing in his mind. He didn't have to carry the weight of being a savior, but he could carry the responsibility of standing up for what was right. The next day in court, Malcolm spoke with a newfound clarity. Called back to the stand for rebuttal testimony, he recounted the moment Daryl Hunt had cuffed him, his voice steady and firm. "This isn't just about me," he said, looking directly at the jury. "It's about everyone who's ever been treated like they don't matter. I'm not here to punish Officer Hunt. I'm here to remind everyone in this room that we do matter." Judge Elaine Thompson, observing Malcolm's testimony, felt a surge of admiration. His words were raw and unfiltered, the kind that reminded her why she had pursued justice in the first place. But Elaine's own transformation was still unfolding. The anonymous threats, the public scrutiny, and the internal conflict had tested her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. One evening, she met with her longtime mentor, Judge Robert Calloway, a retired jurist who had guided her through her early career. Over cups of coffee in his quiet home, she voiced her fears. "What if I make the wrong call, Robert?" she asked, her hands wrapped around her mug. "What if I let my own biases cloud my judgment?" Robert, a man of few but measured words, leaned forward. "Elaine, You've spent your entire life preparing for this. The fact that you're questioning yourself shows you care about doing the right thing. Trust your instincts. Trust the law. But above all, trust that the truth always has a way of surfacing. Those words stayed with Elaine as the trial's final days approached. She began to see her role not as an arbiter of guilt and innocence alone, but as a guidepost for what justice could and should look like in Riverside. Her impartiality remained intact, but her resolve to confront the underlying systemic issues had grown stronger. Meanwhile, Rachel Alvarez's journey was one of finding her voice. Isolated at the precinct and hounded by whispers of betrayal, she had questioned whether speaking out had been worth it. But as news of her testimony spread, Rachel began receiving messages of support from strangers, fellow officers in other departments, and even community members she'd once patrolled. One note in particular struck her. "We need more officers like you. Don't give up." It was signed by a black father of 3. Galvanized, Rachel made a decision. She approached her captain and formally requested a transfer to the department's community outreach division. "I want to rebuild trust," she explained. "Not just with words, but with actions." Though her captain was reluctant, the growing pressure on the department to implement reforms made it difficult to refuse. Even Daryl Hunt, though outwardly defiant, could not escape the weight of the trial. The cracks in his confidence deepened with each passing day as the evidence against him mounted. One night, sitting alone in his dimly lit living room, he replayed Rachel's testimony in his head. Her words stung because they were true. For the first time, Daryl allowed himself to wonder, had he really been doing his job, or had he been hiding behind his badge to justify his prejudices? The next morning, Daryl surprised his lawyer by suggesting they consider a plea deal. "I just want this to end," he muttered, though Elliot Grayson quickly dismissed the idea. "We can still win," Grayson insisted. But for Daryl, the trial had already taken something he couldn't articulate. For the first time, his actions felt heavier than his pride. Outside the courtroom, Riverside itself began to show signs of change. The protests continued, but there was a noticeable shift in tone. Activists started organizing community forums, inviting local leaders and police officers to discuss reforms. Churches opened their doors for town halls, and young people began registering voters en masse. What had started as anger was transforming into action. The trial had become more than a courtroom drama. It was a catalyst for Riverside's reckoning with its past and a vision for its future. The city's scars remained, but the wounds were being tended to in ways they hadn't before. As the trial headed toward its climax, the key players found themselves changed by the journey. Malcolm had grown into his voice, Elaine into her resolve, Rachel into her purpose, and even Daryl into a man forced to confront his own failings. Each step, each decision, brought them closer to the moment of truth. As the trial neared its conclusion, the air in Riverside felt electric, heavy with anticipation and uncertainty. Each passing day added new layers to the unfolding drama, and the city braced itself for the impact of the verdict. The key players, Malcolm, Elaine, Rachel, and even Daryl, each carried the weight of what was to come, knowing their choices in these final moments would define not just their fates but the future of a deeply divided community. Malcolm spent his last night before closing arguments in solitude, sitting on the worn steps of his childhood home. The house, though modest, had been a sanctuary for him and his sister growing up. He gazed out at the quiet street, the distant hum of the city punctuated by the occasional shout from the protests still rumbling downtown. His mother, Linda, approached with a cup of tea, her soft footsteps barely audible. "You've been so strong," she said, sitting beside him. "Stronger than I ever thought a person could be." Malcolm looked down, the warmth of the tea grounding him. "It doesn't feel like strength, Mom. It feels like survival." Linda placed a hand on his. "Surviving is part of it, but the way you've stood up for yourself, for all of us, that's strength too." Her words settled over him like a protective blanket, and for the first time in weeks, Malcolm felt a small flicker of peace. At the courthouse, Judge Elaine Thompson prepared her instructions for the jury, carefully considering every word. She had spent countless hours deliberating on how to frame the legal questions while remaining neutral. But neutrality felt like a tightrope walk on a line that was fraying with each step. The evidence was overwhelming, yet Elaine knew that no matter her actions, someone would accuse her of bias. She inhaled deeply, her fingers brushing the engraved scales of justice on her bench. In her chambers, Elaine opened a drawer containing a photo of her late father. It had been taken on the day she graduated law school, his proud smile as broad as the horizon. "I wish you were here," she murmured. "I hope I'm making you proud." Her focus shifted back to the case. She couldn't afford distractions now. Tomorrow, the jury would begin their deliberations. But tonight, it was her duty to ensure that every instruction she gave was legally sound and fair. The justice she believed in demanded no less. For Rachel Alvarez, the preparation for the climax wasn't just legal, it was deeply personal. After testifying, she'd returned to the precinct to icy stares and whispered slurs. But tonight, as she packed her belongings into a cardboard box, she felt lighter. Rachel had submitted her resignation earlier that day. She had decided to join a non-profit organization working on police reform, where her voice could contribute to rebuilding trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Before leaving, Rachel walked through the precinct one last time. She paused at the break room door, where she overheard two officers muttering about her betrayal. She felt a surge of anger, but it quickly gave way to resolve. Let them talk, she thought. I know I did the right thing. Daryl Hunt, meanwhile, was in free fall. The weight of the trial had crushed his confidence, leaving behind a man wrestling with a growing sense of shame. At home, he barely spoke to his wife, Karen, who had grown tired of his defensiveness. "You've never once admitted you were wrong," she said during a tense argument. "Not to me, not to yourself, not even to those people in court." "What do you want me to say, Karen?" Daryl snapped. "That I'm some kind of monster? I did my job." Karen's eyes softened, though her voice remained firm. "Maybe you should stop thinking about what the job asked of you and start thinking about what kind of man you are, because right now I don't recognize you." Her words lingered long after she left the room. For the first time, Daryl allowed himself to consider the possibility that Karen was right. Outside the courthouse, the protests had grown into an unstoppable force. Activists set up food tents and first aid stations, transforming the space into a community gathering point. Musicians played songs of hope and resistance, and speakers took to makeshift stages to share stories of their struggles. The atmosphere was tense but alive, the collective energy a testament to a community that refused to be silenced. As the final day of arguments approached, the stakes couldn't have been higher. The jury was visibly fatigued but attentive, their expressions revealing the emotional toll of the case. Angela Carter, the prosecutor, refined her closing argument late into the night, her assistant bringing her coffee as she rehearsed her points. "We cannot undo the harm that's been done," Angela practiced aloud. "But we can send a message. We can say that no one, not even those sworn to uphold the law, is above it." On the defense side, Elliot Grayson was equally restless. He reviewed his notes, determined to convince the jury that Daryl was a victim of an overzealous system. But even he couldn't ignore the cracks in his case. Rachel's testimony had been a turning point, and no amount of spin could erase its impact. By the time the courthouse doors opened the next morning, Riverside felt like it was holding its breath. The trial had been a storm, shaking every corner of the city. And now, as the closing arguments loomed, the entire community stood on the precipice, waiting to see whether the promise of justice would finally be fulfilled. The day of closing arguments began with an eerie stillness in Riverside. The morning air carried a sharp bite, and even the protests outside the courthouse seemed subdued, as if the crowd itself was holding its breath. Inside the packed courtroom, every seat was filled. Journalists, community leaders, and everyday citizens sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces tense with anticipation. The trial of Officer Daryl Hunt was more than a courtroom drama. It had become a crucible for the soul of a city. Angela Carter, the prosecutor, was the first to address the jury. She stood at the center of the courtroom, her presence commanding, but not theatrical. Her voice was steady, resonating with conviction as she began her closing statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, pacing slowly, "you've seen the evidence, you've heard the testimony, and now I'm asking you to make a decision, not just about Officer Daryl Hunt, but about what kind of community we want to be." Angela paused, her gaze sweeping across the jury box. Malcolm Brown wasn't doing anything wrong that night. He wasn't breaking the law. He wasn't a threat. And yet, he was treated like a criminal. Why? Because of the color of his skin. Because Officer Hunt chose to see a stereotype instead of a person. She gestured toward Malcolm. who sat quietly with his hands folded. Malcolm isn't just a victim, he's a survivor, and his courage in coming forward is why we're here today. But let's be clear, this isn't just about him. This is about a pattern of behavior. Officer Hunt didn't act alone. He operated within a system that allowed him to target people of color with impunity. But today, you have the power to say, enough. Angela's voice rose slightly, her passion undeniable. This isn't just about accountability for one man. It's about sending a message that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it. The room was silent as Angela returned to her seat. The jury members avoided each other's eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. Elliot Grayson, Daryl Hunt's defense attorney, rose next. His approach was deliberate, his tone calm but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "my esteemed colleague has painted a picture of my client as a villain, but I'm here to remind you that there are two sides to every story." He walked toward the jury, his expression somber. Daryl Hunt is not perfect. None of us are. But he is a police officer who dedicated 15 years of his life to protecting this community. He made a split-second decision that night based on the training and instincts that have kept him alive on the job. Was it a mistake? Perhaps. But was it criminal? Absolutely not. Grayson leaned on the jury box, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Every day, officers like Daryl Hunt put their lives on the line. They don't have the luxury of hindsight. They don't get to press pause and analyze every detail before acting. They make decisions in the moment, under pressure, with the sole goal of keeping our streets safe. To convict him would be to criminalize the very people who protect us. He straightened, his voice firm. "I'm not asking you to excuse bad behavior. I'm asking you to recognize that mistakes happen, and those mistakes don't define a person's entire career. Don't let one incident erase years of service." Grayson returned to his seat, his argument hanging in the air. Judge Elaine Thompson addressed the jury next, delivering her instructions with the precision and gravity the moment demanded. "Your duty," she said, "is to decide this case based solely on the evidence presented in this courtroom. Set aside your biases, your emotions, and the noise from outside these walls. Focus only on the facts." As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, the room buzzed with hushed conversations. Elaine called for a recess, and the crowd spilled out into the courthouse hallways, where reporters scrambled to interview anyone willing to speak. For hours, the city waited. Protesters outside the courthouse chanted, their voices alternating between hope and anger. Inside, Malcolm sat with his mother, Linda, who squeezed his hand every time he looked at the clock. Rachel Alvarez, seated near the back of the room, stared at the floor, her mind replaying her testimony over and over. Daryl Hunt sat with his lawyer, his face pale and his hands fidgeting. For the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain, the bravado he had carried throughout the trial now replaced by a visible unease. Finally, as the sun began to set, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as they filed into their seats, their expressions unreadable. Elaine entered and took her place on the bench, her voice steady as she asked the foreperson if the jury had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, standing with a folded piece of paper in hand. The bailiff carried the verdict to Elaine, who read it silently before nodding. She handed it back and the foreperson began to read aloud. "On the charge of abuse of power, we find the defendant, Daryl Hunt, guilty. On the charge of racial discrimination, we find the defendant, Daryl Hunt, guilty. On the charge of excessive force, we find the defendant, Daryl Hunt, guilty." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by muffled cheers from Malcolm's supporters. Daryl's shoulders slumped, his face ashen. Elaine's gavel struck sharply. "Order in the court," she said firmly. Elaine addressed the jury. "Thank you for your service. This trial has been a test of our commitment to justice, and your dedication is deeply appreciated." As the courtroom erupted into a cacophony of emotions, cheers, sobs, and quiet whispers, Malcolm exhaled deeply, his mother wrapping him in a tight embrace. Outside, the news of the verdict spread like wildfire, the protesters erupting into jubilant cries of triumph. The system had spoken. Justice had been served. But for Riverside, this was just the beginning of a long road toward healing. As the gavel struck for the final time that day, signaling the end of the trial, the weight of the verdict reverberated through Riverside. The courtroom buzzed with a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and a quiet, simmering anger from those who believed Daryl Hunt had been wronged. Judge Elaine Thompson maintained her composed demeanor, though the significance of the moment was not lost on her. She had presided over a case that wasn't just about one man or one incident, but about the soul of a community crying out for change. Malcolm Brown stood at the center of it all, his expression a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. As his supporters surrounded him with congratulations and embraces, he couldn't help but feel the surreal weight of it all. His fight for justice had turned into something much larger than himself. "I don't even know what to say," Malcolm admitted to his mother, Linda, as they left the courthouse under the watchful eyes of reporters and protesters alike. She smiled and took his hand. "You don't have to say anything, baby. You've already done enough." Nearby, Rachel Alvarez stood quietly, watching the scene unfold. The former officer had risked everything to tell the truth, and though she felt vindicated, she also felt the sting of isolation from her former colleagues. Yet, as she watched Malcolm and his family leave the courthouse, she felt a sense of peace. Rachel knew she had done the right thing, not just for Malcolm, but for every person whose voice had been silenced by the system she once upheld. For Daryl Hunt, the verdict was a crushing blow. Led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, he avoided eye contact with the crowd outside. The smirk he had once worn so proudly was long gone, replaced by a hollow stare. His lawyer, Elliot Grayson, issued a curt statement about appealing the verdict, but even he seemed resigned to the outcome. Daryl had been held accountable, something he never thought possible. The verdict sent shockwaves across Riverside. For the Black and brown communities, it was a long overdue validation of their struggles, a sign that change might finally be possible. Churches held special services of thanksgiving, activists planned new initiatives, and conversations about police reform gained fresh momentum. But there were also those who felt betrayed by the system they had trusted. A small but vocal group of Daryl's supporters vowed to fight back, framing him as a scapegoat for broader societal frustrations. Judge Elaine Thompson, returning to her chambers after the verdict, allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She removed her robe, hung it carefully, and stared at the photo of her father on her desk. "We did it," she whispered. "We made it count." The city of Riverside, though scarred, stood at a crossroads. The verdict wasn't a solution to all its problems, but it was a step forward, a crack in the foundation of systemic inequities that had long defined its story. And for Malcolm, Elaine, Rachel, and even Daryl, life would never be the same. Months after the trial, Riverside began to take its first tentative steps toward healing. The verdict against Daryl Hunt sent ripples through the city, not just in the legal and political spheres, but in the hearts of its people. For the first time in years, many felt that the scales of justice had tipped in their favor, even if only slightly. Police reforms were rolled out with cautious optimism. Body cameras became mandatory, and officers underwent extensive training in de-escalation and anti-bias practices. Community leaders and police officials formed oversight committees to ensure accountability, though skeptics doubted how effective these measures would truly be. Still, it was progress, and progress, however small, was something Riverside desperately needed. Rachel Alvarez, who had resigned from the force, became a visible advocate for change. Joining a nonprofit focused on bridging the gap between law enforcement and communities of color, she used her experience as both an officer and a whistleblower to push for reforms. Her journey wasn't easy. She still received threats and faced backlash from former colleagues, but she found solace in the lives her work touched. "If I can change one mind," she said in a local interview, "then it's worth it." Malcolm Brown returned to law school, his name now a symbol of resilience in Riverside. Though he had never sought the spotlight, he understood the responsibility it carried. He graduated with honors, his journey inspiring countless others in his community to believe that change was possible. Malcolm took a position at a civil rights law firm, his first case involving a young man arrested under similar circumstances to his own. When asked about his future, Malcolm often said, "I just want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." Judge Elaine Thompson continued her work on the bench, the trial cementing her reputation as a symbol of fairness and integrity. While her impartiality had been tested in ways she never expected, Elaine emerged stronger, her faith in justice intact. At a community forum weeks after the trial, she addressed a group of young students. "Justice isn't perfect," she said. "It's messy and it takes time, but we must keep pushing for it, no matter how hard the fight gets." As for Daryl Hunt, his story faded from the headlines but remained a cautionary tale. Serving his sentence in a facility far from Riverside, he was left to reckon with the choices that had brought him there. His once proud arrogance had been replaced by a quiet bitterness. Though some in Riverside still viewed him as a scapegoat, most saw his conviction as long overdue accountability. The city itself was far from perfect. Deep wounds remained, and divisions within the community were still evident. Yet the trial had sparked something undeniable, a belief that change was possible if people stood together. Protests gave way to town halls, and debates turned into dialogue. Slowly, Riverside began to rebuild, not just its policies, but its trust. The story of Riverside is more than a tale of a trial or a verdict. It's a reflection of the challenges every society faces in the pursuit of justice. It's a reminder that systemic change begins with individuals, those who choose to speak up, to act, and to hold systems accountable. For everyone reading this, the question remains, what role will you play? Will you stay silent, or will you take a stand? Will you demand accountability in your own community? Like Malcolm, Rachel, and Elaine, we each have the power to create ripples of change, no matter how small they seem at first. This is your call to action. Share this story, talk about its implications, and think about what it means for your world. Justice doesn't come easily, but it begins with us. Change is possible, but only if we're brave enough to fight for it.